and welcome back. Thank you very much for sticking with us. So we'll dive straight in again, as we've already spoken about the three core topics that we're going to go through: startup strategy, sales and business development, and digital marketing. Here we're diving into the first session around introduction to startup strategy. One of the best ways to move through this course is certainly when you're watching these videos, make sure you see them as an overview as to what we're actually looking at and what we're trying to learn and what we're trying to actually accomplish here. What I'd say is make sure that you're going through all of the videos that are aligned and attached and are embedded within this course, because that's where you'll get a lot of the value through that, and through these video discussions that we're trying to do. I'm trying to keep them fairly short to make sure that we're focusing on the key points to take away. And also to try and make sure that you're really understanding how you can implement these ideas into your business and into your business idea. So with that, let's dive into the first part of startup strategy, which really looks at the lean startup. The key idea of the lean startup, and perhaps some of you have heard of it, perhaps some of you haven't. It was coined by a man called Eric Ries. He was really focused in trying to understand entrepreneurship in a lot more detail. What he'd seen in the past in terms of entrepreneurship was that there were people who had a particular idea. They thought they had a great solution and spent a lot of time, money, and effort in building that solution, and then tried to take it to market, only to realize that the market didn't actually want what was on offer, or they only wanted a certain part of it. And so what it meant was that there were entrepreneurs that were spending lots and lots of money to try and build up their business idea. And they were spending a lot of their time as well to put this all together, to then take it to the market, to get their first piece of customer feedback once they've done all the prep, all the investment, and all the build before. And what he wanted to do was essentially take a step back and say, hang on a second, what about if we had a different methodology towards entrepreneurship? What about if we could first focus on the problem that we're trying to solve? So many of us, and I'm sure you've probably heard it when you're speaking to people, start a sentence when you're talking about a potential business idea with, wouldn't it be great if we had an app that did X, Y, Z? And we're looking at the solution already. And we in some sense, and I've certainly been there in the past myself, is trying to fit a certain solution to a problem, rather than starting with the problem that we're actually looking to solve. So let's take my own business really with the interner, and how we were trying to build that out, and how I used the lean startup to build that business idea. It was essentially, I sat down and said, well, what is the problem that I'm trying to solve? From one perspective, there were students such as myself who were going on a placement year looking for an internship. But actually the difficulty in the problem that I was trying to solve was that there wasn't really a market there. There wasn't a simple market to allow someone to find an internship that would actually give them all the things that they really wanted as well, which was great exposure, great learning and responsibility from a young age. On the other hand, there were startups that were wanting to grow, but didn't have the ambitious resource that they could actually implement, that would come into their business and actually be able to deliver value right from the very beginning at a relatively low cost without having to hire somebody full time. There wasn't that huge risk. And so by trying to solve both of those problems, I came up with obviously how essentially the internet and what it is, and how it actually solves these problems for startups and both interns alike. But the way that I went around that was actually really focusing first on the problem that I was trying to solve. So what I would say is, if you are a solopreneur, a side hustle enthusiast looking to start your own business, the first thing that I would always recommend, from essentially taken from the Lean Startup, is make sure you read the book. It's a brilliant book and really interesting, and brings out a lot of ideas. But one of the core elements of it is making sure that you focus on the problem. Can you define the problem that you're looking to solve? And can we use customer feedback in order to validate that? So the Lean Startup is really around defining the problem that we're trying to solve and using validated learning to see whether this is essentially successful, or whether we're on the right path. So the first thing that I want to look at here is the business model canvas. Now, the business model canvas was coined actually by an academic called Steve Blank. definitely recommend you sort of reading a bit more into the business model canvas and what it actually is. What it allows us to do is be very hypothesis driven and understand from several perspectives how we might take a product to market. So what we're really looking to do here is try and determine certain areas where we want to have thought around our business idea. So what you want to do when you've got the business model canvas is put your business idea at the top. And what we're looking at here is certain areas where we want to actually test in the market. So the first part that you might want to focus on is that value proposition. What's the value that we're really bringing to the market with what our solution is going to potentially solve? Who are the customer segments? Is it one particular customer? Do you have multiple customers? And then sometimes you might not necessarily just have one customer. You might have multiple customers, but also you might have a marketplace in which you've got buyers and sellers, for example, where only one of them is really the paying client. So I would probably try to split those up as well. So yes, you might have multiple users, but only one of those types of users would be the client. And by client, I mean the actual person who is going to be paying for your service. Then you might want to look at some sort of key partners. How are those partners going to help me build my business? So realistically, one of the ways that you can really push your business idea forward and get validated learning, certainly in the initial stages, is actually working with some amazing partners. So trying to define who those partners are and where they're going to be is really important. Then you might want to look at some sort of cost structure or revenue streams that you might potentially look to commercialize, right? So how are we actually looking to commercialize our product? How are we looking to commercialize our solution? So the business model canvas, I'd sit down, and the way to really fill this out is actually with either digitally, so you can change it, or with sticky notes, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to be really hypothesis driven. So if there's anything you take from this section of the course, make sure that you're really hypothesis driven in terms of what you're trying to solve for your ideal customer. So in terms of the tools that we really want to develop and that we really want to be driving forward, the customer development model, again, is essentially derived by Steve Blank and taken forward then by Eric Ries in his work within the Lean Startup. The customer development model really breaks down into two areas. We've got the search stage and the execution stage. And if you're right at the beginning, if we're looking to go from 0 to 1, then we are predominantly here. We're in the search stage, customer discovery and customer validation. So first of all, what do we mean by customer discovery? Customer discovery is all around trying to define what our problem is. What problem are we trying to solve? And what we want to do is be able to write that down essentially in hypothesis format. We believe that the X problem exists. And before you then start to go on to any sort of solution, we want to now essentially validate this. So what Steve Blank talks about, and his key phrase is get out of the building. So remember that, get out of the building. Once we've defined or think that we've defined our initial hypothesis of the problem that we're trying to solve, let's get out of the building. And here, you already know what customer segments you're likely to target and you think have that problem. Let's go out there and find out. So how do you then go around and find people in your target market? Well, it really depends on what the problem is that you're trying to solve. So I was first targeting a market for students. And so whilst I was at university, I could quite easily get in contact with a lot of students, but equally, even if you're not at university and you're looking to contact students, there will be ways that you can find to get in contact with them via the university, via Facebook channels, via the university societies, etc. So there are ways that you can get in contact there. The other problem, the other side of the marketplace I was trying to solve for was on the startup side. So where could I actually get in contact with startups? Well, LinkedIn was a brilliant way for me to search for someone who's got the name, who's got the figure CEO or founder. Generally, founder was easier for startups because CEO was essentially a huge step. So we could have done founders specifically in the UK or specifically outside of the UK. So you can really tailor your search. So LinkedIn is really, really helpful. Reach out to them on LinkedIn, essentially asking just for a little bit of their time because you want the feedback. You want the feedback on the problem that you're trying to solve. Similarly, there'll be multiple ways in which you can then actually try and get feedback from your customers. One of the ways is actually by building a landing page and then actually driving traffic to that. So be that via paid ads, be that via Google AdWords. Would I suggest that in the initial stages? Probably not. I think that you can actually target your market and then find it organically. So what I mean by organic is that we're not actually spending money on driving customers to our site. It's something that you can do, but often when you're trying to go from 0 to 1, keeping as much capital as possible is massively, massively important. So the first thing to use is things like LinkedIn, or really try and scope out, how can I find some people in my target market? And once you sit down with them, ask them about that problem. Do they have that problem? How are they solving it today? Would they be willing to spend money on a particular solution? And so what you really want to do through the customer discovery phase, which is probably the most important phase of the whole thing that you're going to do, is actually determining whether your problem actually exists in the world and how at the moment it's currently being solved. So people might be paying for a particular solution at the moment, or they might just say it's really, really difficult and they have a workaround. With all of this feedback, you can go back and hopefully you've collected feedback from say 10, 20 people. You can sit down and then move on to stage 2. Now we're looking at really customer validation. And what customer validation means is we've really understood the problem. Now, can we find a solution that actually fits it? Can we find a solution that fits the bill? So this is when you're ideating, coming up with ideas of how you might actually be able to solve that problem. Is it via a marketplace online? And then when we're creating that potential solution, which we'll go on to next, that's when we're really trying to focus on and actually test that solution with our customers. So we go back to the same people and we say, this is a solution I've come up with. Does it work? And that solution could be as simple as building it on paper, drawing shapes, or it can be as simple as building it on PowerPoint and actually saying, let's pretend this is the interface of the app. And if you click this button, it moves to the next slide and it shows you what will be on. So you don't need to go and spend all this money building an app. Rather, we can just build a mock-up, or what we call a minimum viable product, which we'll go on to test that idea with the market and gain valuable feedback. And it's that feedback that we'll then use to, as you can see, move back towards customer discovery. If they say this really doesn't solve the issue, well, then the question is, does it not solve the issue because of the solution? Or in fact, is it the problem itself that needs to change? Do we need to redefine the problem that we're trying to solve? And this is what you get out of those customer interviews. And if it is a change, then we do something called a pivot. And this is where we'll move on to later, which is, do we pivot or persevere? So the search stage is really where we're focusing now. And once you can nail this down, only once you've nailed the problem, solution fit, do we then move on to things like customer creation and company development. These are the further execution stages. And essentially we move from problem solution fit through to product market fit. So I definitely recommend diving deeper into the customer development model. There's a brilliant book by Steve Bank, quite a large book called 4 Steps to the Epiphany. Definitely recommend reading. It was one of the first books that I read and really goes into a lot more detail than I have here. But essentially that's the overview of how this works. So what we were mentioning in this stage here around the customer validation, where we're trying to build a solution and trying to test that solution, one of the ways that we can do that is through something called a minimum viable product, an MVP or a prototype. And essentially, a minimum viable product is what Eric Ries termed as creating essentially the smallest scale, the smallest solution for the lowest cost that you can create that goes the majority of the way to solving the problem that we've already predefined. And the reason that we predefined it is because we've worked with customers to validate that that problem actually exists. And an MVP can, as I've mentioned before, can be something as simple as a PowerPoint deck that takes you from one slide to the other as if you're moving through an app. Or you can create a mock-up website, either using a tool such as WordPress or Wix, or you can use a lot of these email marketing software tools such as MailChimp or MailerLite allow you to create landing pages online, and you can essentially try to build that out. But you don't even need to go and go all the way. You can literally build something that's very, very small. If it's a product as well, you can start to build that product or even draw that product and essentially show that prototype to your customer. The question of how minimum is a minimum viable product is still one that's to be answered. But what I would probably argue is that once you've built a minimum viable product, then even halve that and make it even smaller, because you don't And quite often you'll find that you end up spending so much time building that minimum viable product that actually you've even gone a step too far. So what I would definitely suggest is that when you're building that minimum viable product, is that you've got in mind that I need to get this out to customers as quickly as possible to test. Now, when we're testing the minimum viable product, we're not looking to charge for this. We're not looking to make money out of it. If you can, wonderful, fantastic, be my guest. But what this is really about is driving something that Eric Ries terms as the build, measure, learn feedback loop. And this is incredibly, incredibly important because it fits in perfectly with what Steve Blank is talking about within his first ideas of customer development. Now, customer development here, as we've seen before, is around what's our problem and what's our solution. Can we gain the feedback that we need, the learning that we can get to go back to customer discovery, or indeed to recreate stage 2, the customer validation part. So we have an idea of the problem that we're trying to solve, and we've already got an MVP now. We go out to the market, we've got our idea, we've built our MVP, we've got essentially a small product, and now we go out to the market and we measure. Did they like it? How long did they use it for? How did they use it? What was their feedback? And off the back of that feedback, which is essentially the data part, the information that we're collecting, we then learn something. They either loved it, let's go forward, or there were certain changes that they want. So now we go back and we implement that learning and we create a new idea. Essentially, maybe a few changes. There might be a couple of features changes. It might be a radical change. And then we've built something else. And then we go back out and we test. And essentially the question then is, which you're probably asking yourself, well, how often do I go through this feedback loop? So there are a couple of answers here. One of them is the practical way. So you can essentially, Eric Ries argues, go through this feedback loop as many times as you can until you burn all your capital. And the ideal stage is that actually you go through this in as fewer times as possible, or fewer times than actually means that you've burned through all your capital and you can't out iterate anymore. And so once you actually get some traction, get interest from customers, that's when you can start to develop it further. And so what we're really looking to do is trying to, again, gather that feedback. Now, how long does it take to do this? You could literally do this within a week. Once you've got all the interviews set up, once you've sat down for the evening and built your mock-up on PowerPoint, you can then go and test it and see whether people actually have that problem and whether they think, they would use that solution. So the question therefore is, okay, minimum viable products give us that element of feedback and we can keep going round and round and round. But what about if we learn something fundamental? And what do I mean by something fundamental? I mean, something that actually changes the way that we might actually do business, or changes the commercial model, or changes the actual solution that we're trying to propose, or changes the problem that we're trying to solve. And this puts us into a part of whether we pivot or whether we persevere. And one of the ways that we decide whether we pivot or persevere is via the metrics that we are using to actually validate our idea and see whether it's essentially going well. So if we're a company that's building, should we really measure, and this is perhaps once you've launched and you're starting to charge for your product, should we measure growth in terms of revenue? Or should we really be measuring our growth in terms of revenue per customer? Because if we're getting a few more customers and our revenue is increasing, well, everything looks fine and dandy. But what about if the revenue per customer is decreasing? Does that give us a sustainable business model? Or indeed, what metrics should we be looking at? And a brilliant example of this is actually Instagram. So I don't know which ones of you might have heard of this, but previously Instagram was called Bourbon, and this was how it initially started. But whilst they were actually looking at the metrics and the way that people used Bourbon and the features that they were really focused on when they actually spoke to their customers, was actually the photo element of it. And people love the photo element of it and the fact that they could make their photos look really quite nice, or you could really focus in on simply that photo element rather than the initial idea, which was all around the initial idea of Bourbon, which is around showing essentially where you checked in, as it were. And so the founders of Instagram sat down and started to understand that actually, they'd taken on around $500,000 of investment by now, and realizing that it wasn't growing. And so they were really talking to their customers and trying to understand why do you keep on using Bourbon, and obviously there was a focus on that photo element. And the further feedback that they got was that people would love to be able to actually put filters on their on their app, or essentially on Bourbon, on what they're doing. So they found that actually it was that filter element that was the most interesting part, and essentially the part that gave them the most satisfaction. And so I think the key point to take out of this story within Instagram is well, perhaps twofold. So the first one is that sometimes you have to pivot, right? You have to pivot on what your actual business, either your business model is, or what you're actually offering to your customer. So perhaps that solution might change. Bourbon changed from Bourbon to Instagram. They changed the solution, so they pivoted. They could have just persevered. And knowing the time when to pivot or persevere is really, really quite difficult. And as you can see here at the bottom, there are several types of pivots. You could zoom in, like we'll go on to essentially show you what Instagram did. They zoomed in. Or you could zoom out. You could change your customer segment. You could change the type of technology. You could have a bit of a platform pivot of what you're doing. Or are you changing the customer need? Are you changing the problem that you're trying to solve? That inherent need, that latent need that we've discovered. Actually, this is the real need. We've dug deeper and deeper and deeper. We keep asking the question, why? Why do you like this? Why don't you like this? How are you solving it? And by asking the right questions, we can use all of that information, data, and feedback to be able to then either pivot or persevere. Are we on the right track? Yes, we need to continue, or we change our business model. So the first key point is the fact that Instagram or Bourbon learned to pivot, and that led to a huge success for them. The second key point is perhaps the point that I find most interesting when I speak to entrepreneurs, and when indeed, obviously, all of my clients are entrepreneurs, and when I speak to them, quite often we think that if we're solving a problem that's too small in a market that's way too small, and we're just focused on one feature, well, we think, well, there's no point doing that. We need to make it larger. We need to focus on every single one. So for example, if it was students, my initial thought was, I need to focus on every single student who might want an internship and every single type of company and bring them together. Whereas in fact, what Instagram did so brilliantly well was they said, actually, it's just one feature out of everything that Bourbon offered. One feature really attracted customers. That was what they were massively interested in. Just the filtering of photos, uploading photos, doesn't matter whether you can check in, do everything else. It was really just, can we make a photo look nice? And by focusing on that, they then essentially their revenue then skyrocketed. They solved a niche in the market, and people absolutely loved it. They were then bought by Facebook for $1 billion. And then their valuation went up to around 100 billion. So it was a brilliant piece. And essentially when I read about and learned about Instagram, I think it's just a fantastic way of seeing that actually you don't need to focus on a huge picture, on a huge market, or on having loads and loads of features. But in fact, using customer feedback was the specific thing that helped Instagram take their business not only from 0 to 1, but then from 1 to many. So I think Instagram was a brilliant tool to use. So I think, again, looking at this sort of bringing this all together in more of a holistic way, let's take away our key learnings from the Lean Startup. And obviously you've got all of these, you've got all of this material here that you can go through in your own time. And I hope that this has really brought it together. But really what we're trying to take from the Lean Startup is Eric Ries's idea, and also Steve Blank, who essentially was a great mentor to Eric Ries, that real focus on the problem. So very often within entrepreneurship, we'll focus on trying to just deliver a solution straight away. Don't waste money, don't waste time on building something massive when you don't know that somebody actually wants it first. So let's really, first of all, let's make sure that we are nailing that problem. Second thing that we really want to be focusing on is actually getting out of the building, this point here. And what that means is speaking to customers. We can't know that we're solving the right thing if we haven't spoken to an ideal customer. Try to really build that and collect all of that feedback, and have a place where you can save it and you can refer to it and use it wisely. Make sure that we're, as you can see here, using that feedback to either pivot or persevere effectively. So using the data, the information, the feedback that we get, you might also be doing some research outside to see where that problem exists, and then whether people are actually interested in your potential solution. And the way that you're seeing that is through a prototype, or indeed, as Eric Ries coins it, a minimum viable product. Don't spend ages building that. Don't spend lots of money building it. Where you can build it is very simply either on a piece of paper or using PowerPoint to bring that together, using Keynote, building a landing page using sites such as WordPress, and putting on essentially simple drag and drop plugins onto your WordPress website. For example, Elementor is a really brilliant plugin that for those who aren't necessarily that tech savvy, including myself, you can just essentially drag and drop on there, and you can build a small mock-up of a website, either on that by actually building the website, or indeed by just building it on PowerPoint. So with that, if you're interested in the lean startup and this idea, in this idea, then please, I encourage you to dive into those additional resources. So you might want to be looking more into people like an experts such as Eric Ries, Steve Blank, Ash Maria, and really diving into those books, diving into those ideas. And there are some further videos here which are a little bit longer than the ones that we've got in the initial stages. But I certainly recommend that you dive into this. The Lean Startup is, as mentioned at the beginning, often described as mandatory reading for entrepreneurs. And the key point here is that we really want to focus on the problem. Make sure that we're solving something. Make sure that we're solving a problem that actually exists in the world, and that from that point onwards, we can then focus on the solution that we're trying to produce. And the customer feedback is the most important thing. So we need to make sure that we really, really get to know our customer. So that's the introduction to the Lean Startup. I hope that you found it interesting. I recommend that you read a lot more into it. The next stage that we'll focus on is design thinking, which is very, very similar to the Lean Startup. There are some nuances, but I think both methodologies and ideas are certainly worth understanding before you dive in, and hopefully take your business idea from 0 to 1.